They were young, vibrant, and full of life, vanishing one by one from the same stretch of road in one of Perth's wealthiest suburbs. Claremont, a place once known for laughter, late-night bars, and the rhythm of an ordinary weekend, became a name whispered in fear. For years, there was no suspect, no confession, no clear pattern, only the haunting certainty that a predator was stalking the night. The city was gripped by paranoia, women afraid to walk home, parents waiting up by the window, headlights slicing through quiet suburban streets. But this killer wasn't a shadowy drifter. He wasn't a monster lurking in alleyways. He was one of them, a man in uniform, a Telstra technician, moving unnoticed between homes, phone lines, and lives. It would take more than 2 decades, 1 million investigative hours, and one microscopic trace of DNA to expose the truth. A truth that revealed not only a murderer, but the unimaginable failure, obsession, and perseverance that defined one of Australia's longest and most complex manhunts. In this video, we'll retrace every step of the Claremont serial killings, from the night the first woman disappeared to the breakthrough that finally unmasked the man who hid in plain sight. We'll uncover how science, patience, and the unyielding love of 3 families turned a cold case into a historic moment of justice. Because behind the headlines and the horror lies a question that still haunts Perth to this day. How could a predator live among us for so long? And how many more secrets still lie buried beneath the streets of Claremont? The Claremont Serial Killings, Australia, 1996 to 1997. The strip of clubs and late-night lights along Stirling Highway had always been Claremont's half-hidden heartbeat, a place where students and young professionals gathered on weekends and where the suburb's late-night taxis hummed until dawn. In the winter of 1996, the lights still glowed, but something had slipped into the shadows that would turn those streets into a place of dread. It began with absence. A young woman who did not come home. On an ordinary night out in January 1996, 27-year-old Ciara Spiers left a club and walked into a city that would not return her. At first, police treated her as a missing person. Families of missing young women know how slowly that first hour can harden into a darkness that never lifts. By the time fear magnetized the neighborhood, the pattern that would lock Western Australia into 2 decades of waiting had already begun. 7 months later, in June, a second woman vanished from the same club strip. Jane Rimmer, 23, left a venue in Claremont the way any young woman might, smiling, joking with friends, hoping to catch a taxi home. CCTV captured her leaving. Minutes later, she had gone. 2 months later, her body was found in bushland, the first tangible confirmation that a predator was working the evening streets of Perth. The discovery cracked the city open. A quiet, affluent suburb that prided itself on safety suddenly felt exposed and fragile. Detectives moved from missing to murder investigation. In the weeks that followed, the force assigned to the case grew. Paths through scrubland were scrutinized. Cameras were reviewed frame by frame. Every taxi driver's route, every last call to a taxi dispatch, everything was a lead. Then, in March 1997, a third woman disappeared. Ciara Glennon, 27, a lawyer who had been out with friends on Claremont's nightlife strip. Her body surfaced weeks later in remoter bushland. Once again, the injuries and forensic trace evidence told the same grim story. Now there were 3 victims, all women, all gone from the same short stretch of nightclubs. 3 lives cut off where the city was supposed to feel safest. By 1997, detectives had a working hypothesis: a single predator preying on women who traveled home alone late at night. They named the investigation Operation Macro. The working theory shaped every allocation of manpower and every late-night stakeout. For many months, the search trudged through ordinary frustrations, misidentifications, tips that led nowhere, and the bitter public pressure to deliver answers fast. The scale of political and media attention only made the work harder. It created promises detectives could not yet possibly keep. Forensic science, however, was the small and steady engine that would keep the case alive. The biological material collected from the crime scenes and from victims, preserved carefully by investigators, became, over the years, the clue that would not be broken, but that would not be thrown away. In the 1990s, DNA technology had clear limits. Scientists could sometimes link samples, but often the traces were too degraded to identify a person in the database. Still, the evidence was preserved to a standard that would later prove decisive. Then decades passed. Operation Macro never entirely shut down. It slumbered, tended by a rotating cadre of detectives who were convinced the solution would come with time and technology. Families of the missing kept vigil in other ways, sustained private campaigns to keep names in the public's mind and to prod authorities to keep investigating. Those names were small, human anchors that refused to let the city forget. In 2008, forensics breathed a new life into the case. Advances in techniques produced a partial DNA profile from material recovered from Ciara Glennon's fingernails, a tiny, tenacious strand of genetic information that linked her killer to the earlier death of Jane Rimmer. It was the first time investigators could definitively say the two murders were the work of the same man. The partial profile did not immediately deliver a name, but it confirmed what detectives had long feared. There was a serial offender who had been active in Claremont. Years more passed while forensic technology continued to sharpen. The case became an object lesson in patience and method. Preserve everything. Never assume. No lead means no truth. Documents show that the police kept every fiber, every trace. They did so purposefully, with the distant thought that one day science might find the missing piece. That day began to arrive in 2016. Detectives had been quietly retesting older material, running it against newer DNA approaches and an expanding database of profiles. A different break came from a case that had once been treated separately: an assault at Hollywood Hospital in 1990, when a man had entered a ward and attacked a staff member. At the time, that attack resulted in minimal penalty and very little public attention. Yet when that man's DNA was later collected in relation to a separate incident and entered into the national database, it matched DNA linked to the Claremont material. The name attached to the profile was a working-class Telstra technician, Bradley Robert Edwards. A careful and methodical build followed. Investigators were no longer chasing a shadow. They had a man whose work and movements could be mapped. Prosecutors compiled years of circumstantial material: sightings of a white vehicle near the abduction points, employment records showing work in the local area, and textile science matches that linked fibers found on victims to uniforms and carpets associated with telecommunications work vehicles used by the suspect. Forensic scientists analyzed microscopic carpet fibers and polymer blends. They compared them to samples from company uniforms and vehicles. The sheer number of distinct matches made the circumstantial weave thick and difficult to deny. When police arrested Edwards in late 2016, Perth felt the first surge of relief that comes when an investigation finally produces a name. The arrest was the product of decades of painstaking work, witness canvasses, preservation of evidence, and forensic patience. It was also the product of a prosecutorial decision to present the case as the intersection of DNA, fiber science, and articulated behavior, rather than as an isolated suspicion. For families, it was both comfort and a reopening of old wounds. After 20 years, the courtroom would again be where private grief and public justice finally collided. The trial itself was high stakes, and by the time it commenced, the public had exhausted hours of armchair speculation. Prosecutors presented the forensic picture that had been assembled, The DNA links to the partial profile from Ciara Glennon, the fiber and material matches that linked Edwards' vehicle and work uniform to the victim's clothing, and the pattern of prior offending that showed an escalation of violence and opportunity. The defense challenged the inferences. They argued about transfer, contamination, and the distance between presence and guilt. The judge would ultimately be asked to weigh the totality, a mosaic of evidence that, piece by piece, could be consistent with innocence or could be read as the relentless outline of a single predator's crimes. When the verdicts finally came, they were both partial and decisive. The court found Edwards guilty of the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon, while finding insufficient proof to convict in the case of Sarah Spiers, whose body was never recovered. The decision was devastating and immense in equal measure. For two families, mothers and fathers who had kept birthdays and anniversaries with clipped calendars and pinned photos, it was the confirmation they had wanted. For some others, it was an imperfect answer that still left questions unclosed. The judge's reasons, set out at length, made clear that forensic linkage and pattern evidence had met the legal standard for 2 of the 3 counts. The legal system had rendered its closest possible answer. But legal verdicts are not the same as social healing. The Claremont years had reshaped the way women in Perth moved at night. They had changed conversations about nightlife safety and the role of employers whose vehicles, uniforms, and work patterns might be co-opted by someone who sought to hide in plain sight. They left behind a generation of witnesses who could never quite trust a white station wagon or an extra set of footsteps on a suburban footpath. Even with Edwards convicted for 2 murders, the city still carried unresolved grief. Sarah Spiers' remains were never located. The absence of her body means one final layer of unknown remains. The families who had waited decades for an answer had some, but not all, of what they needed. The court's judgment did not erase the long winter of fear, nor could it soften the years when girls' faces were printed on missing persons posters nailed to lamp posts. What the investigation did accomplish, beyond the courtroom, was more than conviction. It demonstrated the power of forensic stewardship. The samples taken in the 1990s, saved, cataloged, preserved, became the threads that decades later allowed scientists to stitch together the truth. It showed the benefit of institutional memory, too. Police records, vehicle logs, and work rosters that may have once seemed tangential were ultimately crucial. That, perhaps, is the case's quiet lesson. Small, unglamorous work done carefully over years can change the arc of justice. The human cost, though, remains unquantified. For the families of Jane and Ciara, there was now the constraining relief of a legal closure. For Sarah Spiers' family, the wound stayed open and raw. For the city of Perth, the Claremont years remain a scar, a reminder that safety is sometimes fragile and that predators sometimes slide through the seams of ordinary life. If there is a final irony to the story, it is that the suspect who blended into suburban life, a man who fixed telephones, who spent long days in company vehicles, who wore a uniform like anyone else, was the figure who taught a city the hard lesson that the face of danger can be unremarkable. That lesson is the one families, investigators, and the community have carried with them into the years since. That vigilance, combined with careful science and patient policing, can eventually cut through even the most stubborn shadows. The courtroom was not a place for spectacle. It was quiet, pale, clinical, far removed from the bush tracks where the story had begun. But when Bradley Robert Edwards entered the dock in December 2019, it was as though 2 decades of dread had materialized in one man's shadow. For months before the trial, Perth had whispered his name with a kind of stunned disbelief. A Telstra technician. A husband. A father. Not a stranger lurking in alleyways, but someone who worked in homes, fixed telephones, and blended effortlessly into the routines of the city. When he sat there, hands folded, eyes lowered, many wondered, was this truly the face of the man who turned Claremont into a graveyard of fear? The trial would be unlike most others. Because of the complexity and potential prejudicial publicity, Edwards had elected to be tried by judge alone. Justice Stephen Hull presided, a man of methodical patience and forensic rigor. The task before him was monumental: to distill 25 years of evidence, thousands of witness statements, and the full weight of a city's grief into a fair judgment based solely on what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. From the first day, the courtroom filled with quiet faces, families of victims, journalists, detectives who had grown old on the case. In the public gallery sat Don and Carol Spiers, Trevor and Jenny Rimmer, and Dennis and Ciara Glennon, who had lived for decades with uncertainty. They came to hear, finally, whether the system could articulate what they already felt in their bones. Prosecutor Carmel Barbagallo began with a simple declaration. Between January 1996 and March 1997, 3 young women disappeared from the same area of Claremont. 2 were found murdered. 1 has never been found. The evidence will show that the same man is responsible for all 3. She did not use dramatic flourish. She didn't need to. The strength of the case lay in the microscopic DNA evidence from beneath Ciara Glennon's fingernails, material too small to profile in 1997, had, by 2008, yielded a partial profile. When reanalyzed in 2016, the profile was matched through the National DNA Database to samples from Bradley Edwards. That genetic material had come from an earlier 1995 sexual assault in Karrakatta Cemetery, an attack whose victim had been dragged into the grounds and raped, a crime committed 1 year before the first Claremont disappearance. The court heard how fibers found on both Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon matched the polyester cotton weave of Telstra-issued work uniforms, a rare combination and dye lot consistent with the batch worn by technicians during the 1990s. Additional fibers matched carpet fibers from the interior of Edwards' Telstra-issued station wagon, further linking his work environment to the victims. The technical experts described the work like poetry written in science: polymer strands, dye ratios, microspectrophotometer readings. Small things, almost invisible, that together drew an outline of guilt. The prosecution painted Edwards as a man living a double life. In the early 1990s, he was married, steady, and employed, but cracks showed early. In 1990, he attacked a social worker at Hollywood Hospital, grabbing her from behind while she worked at a desk. He was quickly subdued and arrested, later blaming stress. He avoided jail. After his marriage broke down in 1996, coinciding with the timeline of the Claremont murders, his behavior darkened. He kept souvenirs, hid secrets, and maintained a calm facade in public. Police later found women's clothing and bondage pornography in his home, material never used directly in court to prove the murders, but which hinted at his controlling and deviant compulsions. The defense admitted some of these earlier attacks, but denied the murders. They argued that DNA transfer or contamination could have explained the traces, and that Edwards' uniform fibers might have transferred innocently. They reminded the court that no eyewitness ever saw him abduct anyone. No direct video footage placed him with the victims. But, as the weeks passed, the circumstantial mosaic hardened into something nearly unassailable. Outside the court, Claremont itself stood suspended between memory and relief. For 2 decades, the name had meant fear. Women learned not to walk home alone. Parents waited for late-night calls that never came. Taxi ranks were treated like sanctuaries. Now, every morning, television vans lined the Supreme Court steps, broadcasting updates that reached across Australia. Forensic experts, behavioral profilers, and journalists dissected the evidence nightly. To them, it wasn't just a trial, it was the unraveling of a ghost story that had haunted a generation. Inside, Justice Hall listened, silent, deliberate, clinical, taking notes as witnesses recounted the smallest details. The trial lasted 7 months. More than 200 witnesses testified. The transcripts filled shelves. Each day carried its own small shock. An old photo of a uniform, a forensic diagram, a recording of a mother identifying a daughter's necklace. The human scale of it, the quiet heartbreak of parents recalling the moment hope died, gave the proceedings a gravity no verdict could erase. On September 24, 2020, the court reconvened for the verdict. Outside, Rain pooled on the steps. Inside, reporters sat motionless, pens in hand. Justice Hall's judgment ran to 619 pages. His voice, when he spoke, was measured and final. "I am satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the accused, Bradley Robert Edwards, is guilty of the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon." He paused, then continued, "I am not satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the accused murdered Sarah Spiers." The reasons were painstaking. There was no body, no physical evidence connecting Edwards to Spiers' disappearance, only inference. In law, inference is not enough. The families of Jane and Ciara wept, not in triumph, but in relief. The Spiers family, though grateful for the work of police, were left suspended in a purgatory that has not lifted to this day. On December 23, 2020, Edwards returned for sentencing. The courtroom was packed. Justice Hall spoke of premeditation, control, and cruelty. He described how Edwards had abducted, restrained, and murdered the women for his own gratification. He sentenced him to life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for 40 years, effectively ensuring Edwards will die in prison. Outside, Perth fell silent. The headline that night read simply, "Monster Behind Bars." But inside the families' homes, there was no celebration, only an exhausted kind of peace. As Ciara Glennon's father, Dennis, told reporters, "Today is not a day of joy or celebration. It is the end of a very long journey, and we are grateful that justice has been done." His words carried the dignity that had guided all three families through decades of darkness. In the months after the trial, a wave of retrospection swept across Australia. Podcasts, documentaries, and academic reviews dissected the investigation's mistakes and miracles. Operation Macro, once criticized as sprawling and inefficient, was re-evaluated as a case study in persistence. Detectives like Paul Ferguson and retired Assistant Commissioner David Caporn spoke candidly about the emotional cost of 2 decades chasing a ghost. "You carry their faces with you," one said. "You never stop hearing their parents' voices." The Claremont case also reshaped how forensic evidence is handled in Australia. The long preservation of samples, once considered bureaucratic diligence, became the cornerstone of the conviction. Forensic scientists hailed it as a lesson in the power of patience and evolving technology. Yet, even with Edwards behind bars, not every thread has been tied. The biggest question remains: where is Sarah Spiers? Her body has never been found. Despite multiple searches, some using cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and re-examinations of bushland around Ellenbrook and the Darling Ranges, no trace has surfaced. Edwards has never confessed. He maintains his innocence for all 3 murders, despite overwhelming proof in 2. For the Spiers family, hope and grief now coexist in quiet defiance. Her parents still light a candle on her birthday. Still, sometimes, they visit the bushland, listening for anything that might break the silence. Claremont eventually returned to ordinary life. The bars reopened, new generations moved in, and laughter returned to the streets. But underneath, the memory lingers, a shared scar that reshaped a city's sense of safety. Police have since used the case to train new recruits, emphasizing the importance of continuity in cold cases. The forensic analysts who preserved that tiny strand of DNA, once dismissed as useless, are now honored as heroes of persistence. And in homes across Perth, parents still tell their daughters the story, not to frighten them, but to remind them of vigilance, and of how, even in the face of horror, science and justice can find their way back through the dark. In the end, the Claremont Serial Killings is not just a story of murder, it's a story of endurance. Endurance of families who never stopped asking. Endurance of detectives who refused to close a file. Endurance of science itself, evolving until it could finally speak the truth. When Justice Hall finished his sentencing remarks, he said something that still echoes. "Your crimes were premeditated, brutal, and callous. They left families forever broken and a city in fear. You are now held accountable." For Perth, that accountability was the closest thing to peace. For the families, it was a fragile kind of closure. And for the rest of us, It remains a haunting reminder. The past is never really gone. It waits, preserved in the smallest traces, until the truth can find its voice. If this story gripped you, if the haunting mystery of the Claremont serial killings left you holding your breath, then join us as we continue to uncover the world's darkest and most chilling true crimes. On True Crime Spectrum, we go beyond the headlines, into the evidence, the investigations, and the human stories left behind. Subscribe now and be part of a community that believes every victim deserves to be remembered, every truth deserves to be revealed, and no evil should ever remain hidden. Turn on notifications so you never miss what's next, because the next case might be even closer to home than you think.